Hello and welcome to LGIU's latest panel event, bringing local government professionals from across the globe together. I'm Heather Yedigaroff from LGIU, and as the chair of this event today, I'm really delighted to welcome and say either good morning or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. And as I said, what an audience we have. We have people from so many places. So today's event, as you know, we are focusing on the future. So we are focusing on how we can prepare for 2050 and what the year ahead means for the future of local government around the world. And we're going to do that in a few different ways, which I will explain shortly. But before I do that, just a very brief introduction to LGIU and our purpose. And also I'll say a little bit about why this future focus. So LGIU is a membership organisation supporting local government, and we've been doing that for more than 40 years. And today, more than 300 councils from across the UK, Ireland and Australia are supported by our membership benefits. And one of our key beliefs at LGIU is that we all need to learn from each other around the world. So we host these global panel discussions as one of the ways in which we do that. And why the future focus? So firstly, even those really big global trends that seem massive, AI, demographic change, well, ultimately those changes always come home to roost in local communities, and they affect the things which local government deals with every single day. And the second reason, well, of course, there's so many local issues that we're all wrestling with together, whether it's housing or the EV transition. So that's why we've launched the Future Local Lab, which is a new programme of resources to help local government prepare for and respond to emerging challenges facing the sector. And Future Local will ensure that local government staff and councillors everywhere can learn from and make practical use of the very best in thought leadership and innovation. So before we get into it, just a very brief bit of housekeeping, just to make the discussion just even more interactive and smooth. So firstly, as you'll know, when you came into the room, this session is being recorded just to make sure that we can share it with colleagues who might not have been able to join us at this second. If you're happy to, we'd love it if you had your camera turned on. It's really great for the panel to be able to see your faces. Having said that, please keep yourself on mute just as a default, just till we present any background noise. And most importantly, please get involved. So we're going to do a really interactive session today. We're going to have some live polling, but we'd also love to hear your questions and reflections. However, due to the size of the group, we just ask if you could just do that on the chat function. So housekeeping over. The last thing I'm going to do before I hand over to our speakers is just going to explain very briefly about how today's session is going to run. So first, we will hear from our local government experts from around the world, and they are going to give us their expert view on what 2025 means for the future of local government. And I am absolutely thrilled to say we have 6 different speakers. We have Jonathan Carr-West from England, Pippa Mill from Scotland, Alison Allen from Northern Ireland, Sean O'Riordan from Ireland, Alison Holloway from Australia, and Sam Broughton from New Zealand. So I won't introduce them all in detail, but I'm going to say that for a bit later. But all of those amazing speakers will speak in turn for between 5 to 10 minutes. And once we've heard from them, then we're going to come to you and ask you what you think. As I said, we've got some polling, but we also have lots of opportunity for reflections and discussion and for a Q&A. So I very much hope that sounds like a good way to spend the next 90 minutes. Personally, I think that sounds excellent, and I really can't wait to find out what people are going to say. And on that note, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. So Jonathan Carr-West, Chief Executive from LGIU. Jonathan is a leading international expert on local government. And Jonathan, whilst we know you know an incredible amount about local government around the world, today we're going to ask you just to limit yourself to the place where you're joining from, which is here in England. So Jonathan, please kick us off with your thoughts on what the year ahead looks like for local government in England. I want to hear your top 3 issues and priorities and what they mean for the future of local government around the world.
Yeah, thank you so much, Heather, and welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see so many people from so many places, everywhere from Sydney to Ecuador to my hometown of Braintree in Essex. So a full representation of local government around the world. Look, what does 2025 hold for local government in England? Well, frankly, I think it's going to be a pretty roller coaster year. It's going to be pretty tumultuous. So We have, as most of you will probably know, we have a new-ish government, a Labour government elected in July next year. Last year, that would be a clever trick. Um, July last year, they've come in with a policy agenda around devolution. They launched a devolution white paper the week before Christmas, which has slightly set the cat amongst the pigeons, and they're trying to do two things there. They're trying to create a new layer of local government across England, where we will have what they call mayoral strategic authorities with elected mayors everywhere across the country. We already have that in some places in Manchester and the West Midlands. They want to do it everywhere. And they want to end a rather unique English system, just to explain for some participants from elsewhere. In large parts of England, particularly rural England, you have two tiers of local government. You have a county council that delivers big services across the county, adult social care, children's services, libraries, education, and you have smaller district councils that deliver local services, waste collection, housing, planning, etc. The government wants to abolish that and create a single layer of unitary councils. So a massive level of reorganization where councils are being asked to come forward with proposals for how they're going to restructure themselves. That is obviously quite existential for many councils. There's been this huge rush of activity following the white paper, with more than a dozen county councils have come forward saying they want to be on the priority program for this. They want to do that reorganization. I think, there are still a lot of twists and turns to come in this story. Politics, money, practicality are all going to be big issues as we actually start to move from intention to plan and start to unravel what this really looks like. But wherever it ends up, and I don't think we can be really confident about the final outcome, but we know that it's going to occupy a huge amount of bandwidth for people across local government, both in those areas where reorganization and devolution is happening, but also I think in places where it isn't, because it's just creating it's all the energy of government is focused on that. The Department for Housing and Local Government is focused on that. So I think it's consequential for everyone. But of course, it's not the only thing that's going on. At the same time, the government it has plans to reform how we finance councils. They're moving towards multi-year settlements, multi-year financial settlements, which we expect to come in from next financial year. They're moving towards a new funding formula. They're consulting on future change. But it remains unclear what the outcomes of that look like and how it sits with the intense financial pressure that English councils are under. Because, of course, that is the thing that sits underneath this that hasn't gone away. And again, colleagues in England will be very familiar with this, but for people elsewhere, just to sort of recap, English local government has lost about 40% of its funding over the last 15 years. It's when we do a survey every year about the financial sustainability of local government. This time last year, we're about to do it again. This time last year, 51% of councils, 51% told us that if not basically that if nothing changed, they would go bust within the next 5 years. Now, things have changed. You have a government with a new set of policies, but have they changed enough? I think we wait to see that. You've still got those intense service pressures and indeed some really difficult market failures. So the things that many councils are spending most of their money on, adult social care, children's services, and upper tier councils that provide those services are spending on average around 2/3 to 3/4, sometimes more, of their revenue on those services alone. They're incredibly expensive, incredibly complicated. And demand keeps rising, partly because of demographics, many other factors, and costs keep rising. So in children's services, for example, we see catastrophic market failure in children's residential care. Private providers taking about 23, I think 21 or 23% profit on average out of residential children's homes. Really difficult things for councils to manage costs around. And a lot of those pressures are sort of baked in, right? They're not going anywhere. The population isn't going to suddenly stop aging. We're not suddenly going to have fewer people who require care. So there's, at the same time that there's policy happening and changes and restructures in government and thinking about financing, those day-to-day service pressures continue to rise and rise. Now, the government has been very clear in principle that devolution, financial reform, and public service reform are all part of the same picture, and they're right about that. But in practice, our experience is that those conversations are happening in different silos. So I think in 2025, an awful lot is going to depend on how successfully we in local government and they in central government are able to bring those three agendas together. How can we look at financial reform of local government, public service reform to move towards a preventative model that eases some of those pressures, and devolution and structural reform? How can we see those as a single piece of work? And that's really challenging. But of course, while all that goes on, the world, right? The world is still out there. Now, LGIU, one of the things we do for our members is I go out and work with senior teams to do sort of horizon scanning sessions. And one of the things I always remind people of is, it sounds rather obvious, but the world keeps turning and the world keeps changing. Technology, demographics, climate, economies, geopolitics, all of these things keep changing at dizzying speed and keep creating new challenges and new pressures that local government has to pick up, whether that's around extreme weather events, whether it's around increasing sort of political fragmentation, polarization in the UK. We're in a very, very dynamic, fluid, rather unsettled sort of political environment. We have an electoral system that's designed to basically shuffle between two big parties with a third smaller one. We now have at least 5 parties playing into that. It's very, very uncertain. And of course, that's why we do this Future Local Lab, the learning that we try and initiate across countries, because those sorts of issues, whether it's AI or climate change, they affect councils around the world, and we can all learn from each other. So I think, to conclude, for local government in England, 2025 is going to be a key test of our ability to retain multiple focuses, multiple foci: political, structural, strategic. We need to have our eye on all three of those things, and each of those, I think, carries the risk of sort of crowding out the others. And so the key test is whether we can look across all three at once, thinking about how we manage a sort of dynamic political environment, how we adapt the sort of structural changes that are happening to councils, and how we take big strategic vision on the services we provide and the ways we interact with communities and the changes that we see in the world. We need to balance all of that. And I think our ability to do that will determine whether this is going to be a foundational year in which we really start to build the solid base for local government to succeed over the next 25 years, to move towards the 2050 in a resilient, sustainable way, or not. And I'll leave it at that.
Jonathan, thank you so much. Well, what an opening. We had words like monumental, existential. So, you've given us a sense of a huge amount of change here in England. And as you say, the time will tell whether, that change is realised. So we're going to move straight on to Pippa from Scotland. Before I do, I just want to pay tribute to everyone welcoming and introducing themselves in the chat. We have people coming from Ecuador. It's 2:30 in the morning in Ecuador. Thank you so much for joining us. We also have people introducing themselves as potential future colleagues. So that's so interesting to see. So if you are just joining us, we have heard from Jonathan Carr-West from England, and now we are going to go to Pippa from Scotland. So Pippa's 30 years experience working in local government in both England and Scotland, and Pippa is currently the Chief Executive of Argyll and Bute Council in Scotland. So Pippa, again, I know you could go wider, but what I'd like you to do is just to focus your remarks on Scotland. So please tell us what the year ahead looks like for your local government in Scotland. Again, it's your top 3 issues, priorities, and what they mean for local government around the world. And Pippa, if you could come off mute,
Sorry.
that would be brilliant. Thank you so much.
Typical error. Thanks, Heather, and thanks, Jonathan. Quite a tall order to follow Jonathan there with his opening, and certainly we're watching very closely from Scotland what's happening with the reform in England. So for Scotland, obviously there are some similarities for us So I wanted to talk also about the financial constraints, the reform and transformation agenda, and where we are in terms of democracy and that political engagement. So in Scotland, for people who maybe don't realise, we are in the run-up to Scottish parliamentary elections in 2026. So we have, obviously, we're part of the UK system, then we have a devolved parliament in Scotland, and then we have a single tier of local government. So it will be quite interesting as we see the parties all respond to that upcoming election. We've been in a different but interesting reform and transformation agenda. So just in the last week, the Scottish Government have withdrawn planned transformation in social care. So they were looking at creating a more centralised national care service. So after a number of years of development and debate, that is now off the table. So I think that has led to mixed feelings. I think there was a lack of support in local government and from trade unions concerned other sectors, but high expectation in terms of those that are using social care services. And I think there's a real pressure on us in terms of how we look to deliver the improvement agenda on which there is a fundamental agreement across the board. Education is also a key area, and there is a big push looking at whether that should be focused on teacher numbers and reduce class contact time, but not an agreement on how that will move forward. And then we work and are very dependent on what is happening in health, and there is a push to have a reform agenda. The practicalities will mean with the upcoming election that there will undoubtedly be a degree of short-term focus mixed in with medium long-term focus on what the future of that takes a substantial proportion of the budget in Scotland for public services, and what we're able to do then on social care and those sorts of areas, and the very much needed public reform is going to be dependent on the appetite for the kind of significant change that is required in that sector. There are also other work that we're looking across local government sector in terms of reform and transformation. And I think the real question for us in amongst that is whether we can get the long-term view to a redesigned local government sector in the context of all that change and that inevitable short-term view that will result. I think the other point I wanted to pick up in terms of all of that, obviously, is the financial constraints. So, we have had a number of years of reducing investment in local government, and this budget, although we saw from the UK government an improved investment position, there is still a real strain on budgets in terms of that. We see a projected cumulative budget gap in 25-26 of 392 million, rising to 780 million by 2026. So decisions such as the increase in employers' national insurance in England and the bigger public sector that we have in Scotland will see that underfunded. So almost all the additional money that has been awarded will go into covering those additional costs. And that makes that transformation agenda that I talked about increasingly difficult. And with the decisions to invest more in health, that makes it even more challenging. I think the other bit that we see around budgets is a very limited increase in capital funding. Some of you may be aware, we just saw, and I'm sure colleagues in Ireland are feeling this, the severe impacts of Storm Éowyn. Certainly my area on the west coast of Scotland was badly affected. So ability to invest for growth, transformation and development will be very limited because we're having to focus on asset sustainability and just repair following those poor weather events. Certainly, we're not even recovered from bad storms we had 2 years ago. So that is increasingly like running up a downward escalator, just trying to keep on top of the increasing challenges that we have there. And I think the other element I wanted to talk about is just that in that democratic environment. So I've mentioned the upcoming election. I think that always makes things more interesting in the political environment we work in. But I think we are seeing low levels of trust, both with communities. I think generally our funding mechanisms are not well understood, and we're having debates in Scotland, a number of us, about a visitor levy, and those kind of things are very difficult discussions to have as to how that sits against projected reductions in budgets over future years. So it becomes increasingly difficult to have informed conversations, and different spheres of government all have a different take on how fair or challenged the budget allocations are. I think there is an issue about trust between spheres of government. In Scotland, we had what's called the Verity House Agreement, which was an agreement with Scottish Government and local government about how we would work together very early on in its life, that there were problems with that when Scottish Government unilaterally decided to freeze council tax levels, and we're still working through that. So I think that hampers what we could do together as a force for good. And all of that then impacts on the levels of engagement in terms of people who will get involved in politics. And increasingly what we're seeing is that negativity on social media, and how unpleasant it feels to be involved in that. And I think that is something that we will need to be conscious of. Certainly, we're seeing increase in the number of parties that are actively involved in Scotland, and that will lead to difficult or interesting outcomes in the Scottish Government election, and a likelihood of less likelihood of a majority government or even a coalition being able to be formed. And I think that will create new levels of uncertainty for us. So conscious of my time, Heather, so I think for us it's looking at those financial constraints. It's trying in that context to really look at that whole system, place-based, holistic reform, if we're to get the foundations for the good future. And I think there is something about how we build trust amongst colleagues. We generally have shared objectives, and I think it's how we build that trust so that we can overcome those challenges in the most productive way. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm astonished. What an amazingly concise but also detailed whistle-stop tour through Scottish local government and the challenges you face. So really fascinated to see whether some of these things that you touched on, some of which, quite difficult dimensions, be fascinating to see whether some of the things you touched on will be picked up by our other speakers. So thanks again, Pippa. So Alison Allen, let's come to you. So Alison is the Chief Executive of NILGA, the Northern Ireland Local Government Association. So what's going to be fascinating about Alison is that she's going to give us a slightly different view. So Alison, you're not the chief executive of an individual council, but instead you're working across the country as a whole. So really interested to see what that means in terms of your reflections. So Alison, hand over to you. Please give us your view from Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Heather, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. And I suppose, as Heather has said, NILGA is essentially a regional organisation designed to support local government as a sector, and we are a political organisation. So, balancing all of those difficult political discussions that have been referenced by colleagues as well so far. I suppose the context that have been referred to by previous colleagues is very much the same in Northern Ireland. And our system of government, for those who aren't aware, is really the same as in Scotland. We have UK level government, we have a devolved administration here in Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Executive, and then we have one single tier of local government, which is comprised of 11 local authorities. And I'll make this point now, but I'll maybe come back to it later on, that and it's with reference to the discussion in England around reorganisation. So Northern Ireland went on a reorganisation journey in 2015. It was the first in a significant period of time. I think it was the 70s, 1972 was the last exercise. And that resulted in a political and administrative reorganisation of councils, reducing them from 26 authorities down to 11 authorities, and a range of kind of transfer of functions and all of that as well. And the Department for Communities, who has policy responsibility for this in Northern Ireland, just recently completed a kind of a 10-year check-in to see how progress was going. And I think one of the big lessons is that it's easy to deal with the kind of, the amalgamation of different organisations. It's easy to deal with the administrative functions, of bringing organisations together and transferring functions. But the real transformation of how you look at how services are delivered, how you look at what you're delivering, how you look at how you finance those and make the big difference to the kind of the lives of people with partners, that hasn't been fully realised 10 years in, and I think there's still quite a way to go on that particular journey. And it's just, the reason I say that is I see some of the same language coming through in the kind of policy context for the English journey, obviously. It's not just about saving a few pounds, it's not just about, reducing administration costs and bureaucracy. We all have big ideals that we want to achieve for the people that live in our areas. And I suppose it's just to say that you could probably learn from some of the things that we've done okay and some of the things we haven't done so well here. So we'll definitely be watching with interest. Context is very much the same, despite the fact we have what we think is a fairly stable devolved administration here in Northern Ireland. There has been a fair period of political instability in that in the last 10 years there have been 2 prolonged periods of downtime for the Northern Ireland Executive. And there are a range of reasons for that. The challenging public finances, obviously, they're affecting everybody, are affecting decisions here. I wonder if they're a little bit exacerbated because of our politics, which I'll maybe come back to later on, because we're a consensus-based system. So it's a power sharing based system that operates both at a Northern Ireland level but also at council level. So we don't have a kind of a winner takes all, where the majority can take forward their programme for government, for want of a better word. We do have some unresolved difficulties from Brexit, and it's great to have colleagues obviously from Ireland on the call, because whilst our system is part of the UK system, obviously we share, we share an economy to all intents and purposes, because we're an island. There is so much cultural and societal kind of connectivity, and we look north, south, and east, west, and everything that we do here. Regional balance, and I say that in the context of levelling up agenda from the previous government. But the concept of regional balance is starting to come into policy discussions here, and that is also proving difficult, because everyone has different views and opinions on what that should look like, and there are some real systemic issues as to what's contributing to that, in terms of lack of investment, the ability of jobs, where investors and foreign direct investments prepared to go, where you can support, how do you play to people's strengths, we're a small region, and then the natural advantages that come with capital cities, for example. You just can't ignore those. So regional balance is important, but you just can't ignore those kind of natural advantages. But there are 3 big things, I think, Heather, that we'll be looking to over the next 12 months. And I think the first for us is how we make a real genuine attempt at the integration of public services. So silo-based working is still really prevalent. We're a very fragmented system of public services here. We have a lot of arm's length bodies dealing with the delivery of public service. So the majority are not within the remit of the devolved administration and local government. There's also a set of arm's length bodies with their own governance, their own kind of policy agenda, their own finances, which complicates things. But I think it's important that we start to think about that integration of public services on two fronts. First of all, it's the customer experience. So I think about myself and I think about, so I was a council officer for a long, long time before I took this role. And I think one of the things that I heard most about customer frustrations was that even within a council, the public were frustrated that we couldn't talk to each other and that we came across as disconnected. Working in this role, I see that, that is exacerbated when they hear that, we're talking about mission-based government here as well. We have a programme for government which is talking about those big societal changes that we want to achieve. Those require everybody. They don't just require, they're not just within the remit of one department or one organisation. And when I say the integration of public services, obviously there are opportunities that digital and tech bring for us. And I think Northern Ireland is probably fairly behind the game in the context of UK and Ireland in relation to embracing those, possibly out of a mixture of financial investments, lack of financial investments, and fear, as well, and political instability. But the reason we want to bring those two things forward are that, and I refer back to the conversation about the reform of our previous reform exercise, the low-hanging fruit in the system and in the processes has already been, in my view, largely addressed. And that's just, finances driving that kind of conversation. The difficult decisions, the big decisions about that are affecting public finances and therefore affecting local government, for a range of reasons, including political instability and the fact that we're a consensus-based system. Some may say that we have avoided those difficult decisions for quite a period of time in Northern Ireland, and that in some ways that's contributing to the difficulties that we're experiencing at the moment across health and education, obviously, which suck the money out of the system generally. And when I say that, I mean not just the system of political government, which obviously NILG is a political organisation. So there's a job to get the kind of political and policy agenda on the same space, but there is also, we're talking about the systems of administration, where the actual systems of government and the admin associated with that. It is extremely silo-based in Northern Ireland. An example of that, just to is that each department in the Northern Ireland Executive is an entirely separate accounting body. So we have a head of the civil service and an executive office, but each minister in each department can make their own decisions without reference to others, aside from some very specific circumstances around cross-cutting or politically sensitive issues. So in effect, the civil service is head of the civil service is charged with bringing all these things together, but the permanent secretary in a department reports only to the minister, doesn't report to the head of the civil service. So there are some systemic issues. I think the second thing for us is that it's very much then in the spirit of mission-based government that it just takes a village. We have to an extent, just get over ourselves in public services and recognise that we cannot deal with some of these challenges or optimise on these opportunities on our own. And we need to bring in other partners to the conversation, not just as consultees, but genuinely bringing them in because we recognise they have different sets of skills and knowledge that we don't have, and that it takes everything to be able to move us forward. Private sector, perfect example. Third sector and other partners. But I don't know if others experience this. It'll be interesting, but I think there's an innate suspicion of the private sector in public services, and we're obviously very tied to our work, our procurement work, and how we manage all of that. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how you get people, large organisations, for example, who bring their workforce from Northern Ireland, who have a stake in the country, who want to do the right thing. And investors, I see now that investors are demanding really high levels and good quality CSR from their private sector organisations. The question I have is how are we harnessing that for for public services? So we need to kind of get over that suspicion a little bit. And then I think, as I've hinted at previously, a difficult policy and financial context requires really a massive focus on how we support political capacity and confidence. And I think elected members in Northern Ireland are really effective at operating in their own individual council level in terms of making decisions. There's still obviously the consensus-based politics and then levels of varying comfort around certain decisions that, are just unavoidable and all that comes with that. But I think what the journey we still have to go on is how we aggregate that capacity and confidence for the benefit of showing that local government as a sector can play a much bigger role. So the stats that I throw out periodically are that local government in Northern Ireland is 5% of our public purse. We have fewer responsibilities than our counterparts. Divide that 5 by 11 and it gives you a sense of our scale in terms of pure finances. But the mandate that comes with being a councillor and the presence of councils in local environments, and it really bats well above its weight in that context. So we have to support our elected members to work across parties to understand, yes, we have to make those big decisions, but how do we create political comfort and how do we increase their knowledge and confidence, particularly around difficult things that, I'm happy to admit that I struggle with, some of the tech and digital opportunities. So if we understand what we fear, that thing, it's not just about difficult politics, it's about, we fear what we don't understand, we fear what's going to change and potentially cause complaints or issues with our constituents, because we know the first thing that's going to happen is that those are going to come to us as elected members. I think just all of that requires, all of those three things to work in tandem. But again, bringing it back to the white paper in England, as colleagues have said, it requires more than that kind of bureaucratic and administrative alignment and coming together. There really needs to, from our experience in Northern Ireland, a real focus on genuine transformation and innovation. And I'll leave with this message, in that our experience was that we were the outcomes of that transformation and that exercise were due to be realised as a result of some financial investment, not to individual councils, but regionally to the big ticket items that were kind of causing backlogs and blockages in the local government system here. And it's probably not a coincidence that, due to a whole range of other issues, financial issues included, that investment never came. So we went through a reorganisation exercise and it had to be financed pretty much by councils or through just grants that came with the transferring functions. So there was no focus on how you really invested to save and invested to transform. And that has probably led to, in some part, the limited progress that was reported in that 10-year kind of check-in that I mentioned. So thank you very much, Heather.
Thank you so much, Alison. Again, fascinating. Again, just, a real sort of just a huge amount of interesting insights, not to mention great quotes. So, Alison, there's lots of responses to your talk coming through in the chat, but in the interest of time and hearing from our other speakers, we are going to have to go straight on to Sean. So Sean O'Riordan is from LGIU Ireland. He is one of our linchpins. He's the person who decides what our readers in Ireland will read, but he is also one of Ireland's leading advisors on local and national government. So Sean, without further ado, please give us your perspectives.
Thanks, Heather, and good morning from a wonderfully frosty, blue-skied Dublin. Hopefully it'll keep up for the weekend when we welcome our guests from England for the kick-off of the Six Nations Championship. So Ireland is at an interesting juncture at the moment. The public service in Ireland is one of the smallest proportionately in the OECD. And within that, our local government system is the smallest part of the public sector, with the exception of the defence forces. It's been around for 125 years, and most of those 125 years have been marked by not so much centralisation, but disaggregation, which is something that previous speakers have pointed to, where services have been regionalised or nationalised but within very rigorous silos. So effectively, we have multiple systems of local administration across the 19 government departments, one of which happens to be the only directly elected body, which is the local authority through the Department of Housing, Planning and Heritage. One of the interesting things behind that is that, notwithstanding that level of restriction that historically has been the case, the last decade, it seems that local government has suddenly begun to find its presence being felt at the national level. And as Pippa mentioned there, in terms of the storms over the last few weeks, a sudden realization that local authorities are actually quite handy things to have when it comes to dealing with people who are not getting electricity. Over 1 in 3 households in Ireland were cut off from electricity in the last week, 40% plus from broadband, and about 20% from having access to water, simply because of the collapse of the electrical system, all of which is now being advanced, and being advanced largely thanks to the enabling works of the local authority system. Something, as I say, that has become noticed, shall we say, over the last couple of years, and more particularly the last couple of months. That then against the background of recent general elections, and again, just to remind people that the Irish parliamentary arrangements are one of the longest continuous democratic platforms in the Western world. And we have seen the return, unusually in the context of the international elections going on across the globe, a return essentially of the same government. There are changes in that the Green Party have been essentially voted out of existence and have been replaced by a rural-dominated group of independent parliamentarians. But in essence, the two lead government parties are still in power and have been in power essentially for well over 10 years at this point. Their role in reforming local government has been relatively limited. We have seen one significant initiative, arguably, which is the introduction of a directly elected mayor in Limerick. And apart from that, little enough, because they've been so busy spending money and handing money to local government over the last couple of years on over 570 different annual schemes that has enabled local authorities to go out and do quite a lot of physical work and economic-based work across the country. Having said that, the disaggregated approach to financing local government is a real issue. It's all very well having money, but if you haven't got the people and the skills available to spend the money, it becomes a huge challenge. And I think we're at the point where the local authority system is severely congested in its capacity to actually deliver on local infrastructure and so on, simply because numbers are relatively low in terms of personalities and skills that are available. So we're beginning to see some acknowledgement of that happening at last at the national level, and local authorities are currently preparing workforce plans to have a comprehensive digitalisation strategy to advance digitalisation of public services, so that by 2030, 90% of all services available to people in the state across the country and in receipt of services from local government will be able to do so on digital platforms. More interestingly, with the election of the last couple of weeks, we've seen a significant shift actually in the programme for government. There are over 2,400 actions in the programme for government that have to be delivered over the next 5 years by different parts of the public service, and over 25% of those actions will have to be delivered by or enabled by the local authority system. So a lot of new focus, I think, will come onto the local authority system over the next number of years in the delivery of actions under the programme for government. But within that, and wholly unreported, has been what could be quite a dramatic initiative, in that government has committed to convening a local democracy task force, which will be given a set of instructions, if you like, that they're going to be asked to examine, including the application of subsidiarity across the local government system, across the public service in Ireland, the introduction of greater powers for elected representatives, the introduction of a wider directly elected mayoral role across other cities subject to plebiscite in the country, enhanced powers directly at municipal level. We have almost 100 municipal authorities or municipal districts which operate under the umbrella of the county authorities. And the idea that perhaps they may well become corporate entities in their own right and have a greater range of functions and responsibilities delivered at very local levels, more akin to what you might find on the mainland in places like Denmark, Finland, and the Netherlands. So this final realization, I think, of the benefits of local government is beginning to give an impetus. The Association of Irish Local Government has been very much behind a lot of this work. It's playing a much more positive role now at the national level in trying to influence, if you like, on behalf of local government. The City and County Management Association has been playing a role as well. So we are beginning to see that voice being heard, perhaps arguably for the first time in 105 years of independent government here. We're beginning to see people appreciate the importance of the local government system. So over the next 2 years, one would imagine that there will be a focus on that with a view to having an implementation program brought in over the remaining 3 years of the new government. So there's a lot of interesting ideas out there. There's a lot of interesting potential that could reposition the local government system. One of the things that they do need to look at is the whole financial arrangements for local government. As Alison pointed out, the regime in Ireland is not that much better than it is in Northern Ireland when it comes to financing local government. So about 14% of the exchequer funding annually is local government focused, whereas across mainland Europe, it would be 20-25% and considerably higher in places like Denmark and Finland. So it'll be interesting to see what sorts of ideas come forward there in terms of renewal of the financial arrangements underpinning local government. I would hope that they would get rid of the 570 odd schemes, which is totally ridiculous. So we have public servants in local authorities filling in building up business cases, filling in forms to go up to civil servants in Dublin who are reading and filling out more forms in order to give money that everybody knows the local authority is going to get anyway. So it's in a public service that is severely stressed by lack of resources and skills, using a lot of your staff who could be otherwise engaged in doing other things that are far more important would seem to be a novel idea that we might try sometime in the next couple of years. So we're in an interesting space. Things are reasonably positive at one level if the work of the Democracy Task Force comes to fruition. But it's only if government remains committed to ensuring that what they recommend actually results in substantive reform and delivery along the lines that they're suggesting. What we find ourselves in potentially is a system more similar to what we have on the mainland, as I say, in places like Finland and Denmark and indeed other parts of Western Europe. So a slightly different context to the situation that has been faced in the United Kingdom.
Indeed. Thank you, Sean. So as you said, some different context, but also some clear similarities there. So thank you for that and also for your great summation. So conscious of time, we are running a tiny bit behind. So we are going to go straight to Alison Holloway from Sydney in Australia. Alison, thank you so much for giving up your evening to be here with us today. So Alison, you're the Chief Executive Officer of SGS Economics and Planning, but you are also the lead for LGIU Australia. So LGIU Australia is a partnership between LGIU and SGS. So a little bit different because Alison is a strategic planning expert, very passionate about how places provide opportunities for people. So Alison is a strategic policy and urban planning expert. So Alison, fascinated to see how your slightly different background might impact on your remarks today. So Alison, if you could please come off mute and tell us your view about the challenges for local government in Australia.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you for the wonderful contributions so far. I'm kind of feeling a lot of the common challenges ahead. As I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodians of the land on which I join this call from. I'm in Sydney, and the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And of course, just 800 kilometres or 500 miles down the road in Melbourne, the Women's Ashes Test is underway, that I'm sure all my colleagues in England are following closely. And just as Melbourne's expected a run of days approaching 40 degrees over the next 4 days. And I'll come back to more extreme heat impacts out to 2050 and the role of local government that we're seeing across Australia in that. So if I'm thinking about what has local government, got ahead to 2050 and what does it mean for this year ahead, I think I'll first share a bit of context around Australian local government and then delve into some of those challenges that are cross-cutting across those local governments. And as Heather introduced, a lot of what I'll talk about this evening is from our team's work at SGS with local government across Australia on strategic urban planning, climate change, economic development, and governance and financial outlook as well. So it draws on across that big range. Australia has over 560 local governments. So hearing you talk, Alison, about your 9 in Ireland, in thinking about the different challenges and issues from our biggest in Brisbane City Council, the capital of Queensland, at about 1.2 million people, to some of the smallest in regional WA that are just over 1,500 people. So it's very difficult to talk about local government in Australia, without making broad generalisations, but there are some kind of themes that I'll draw out. So there's big differences from the capital cities to the smaller remote councils, both in terms of population demographics, their economies, environments, communities, but also their responsibilities and the services that they offer, which are a mix of things that they've always offered historically and responding to some of the new challenges where they're the point of last resort, responding to directly community needs. So it's evolving and changing across different communities. But there's a lot of differences as well in responsibilities than what we've heard from other places tonight. So in Australia, local government doesn't have responsibility for health and education, but they certainly feel the impacts of what the state and federal governments do across health and education. And, are often landed with dealing with some of those outcomes where it may not be working or as targeted as it needs to be. What local government does well in Australia is that they know their communities best. They connect with them, they know their key leaders, they're able to listen, they're able to celebrate their communities and tell their stories. So they're really key in addressing these big challenges that we're talking about tonight. And I've got a lot of confidence that they've got a big role in addressing these big challenges to 2050. If we're thinking about the longer term, it's worth considering how our communities are changing. And just recently, the federal government released a new population statement for Australia, which suggests that our population is going to continue to grow, although at a slower pace than recent years and a bit slower than pre-pandemic levels, mainly driven by lower net migration and lower fertility rates. But the growth is also uneven, with WA and Victoria forecast to be the fastest growing areas and Tasmania and South Australia the slowest. And we're going to continue to see urbanisation really driving the growth, with population in regional areas remaining slower, except for some key regional centres probably. So that kind of sets the context for the changes that local governments will see and how they respond in providing their services. But I think if we're talking about the next year in particular and the focus for local government, one of the biggest things on the agenda is the federal election, which will happen before May. We still don't know when. There's lots of suggestions about when it might happen, but it's really going to set up the implications for local government for the rest of the year in terms of different priorities, including funding. So that's something that everyone's watching very closely to see when that's going to happen over the next 3 or 4 months. So there's 2 big challenges that I've identified across Australian local government, and that's housing and climate change. But we know that when we drill down into the details of those, the things that it has implications for is the financial sustainability of councils and community cohesion, which, depends how you structure these things, either challenges or their outcomes, but I'll touch on some of those things briefly and how housing and climate change are impacting on those. So in terms of housing, like a lot of places, Australian cities in particular are a real affordability crisis. The federal government's responded with a housing accord that seeks to bring coordination across the states with a real clear target for the next 5 years for 1.2 million new, well and located homes to address the supply gap and also address affordability. In line with that, they've also released a national urban policy statement to guide those outcomes. But we know that local government already have a lot of these things in hand and are already addressing their local challenges. We know that local government isn't interested in supplying housing, they're interested in building communities. And so there's a real focus across local government of what are the services and infrastructure, open space, libraries, pools, and all those things that make a community, infrastructure and services that are needed to support that increase in housing. So that's where we're seeing a real focus. And I think over the next 12 months, local governments are investing a lot more in thinking about not just meeting their housing targets that have been set, but how do they ensure that achieving those housing targets is going to result in sustainable communities in the long term. Many councils are already playing catch up to their current populations, let alone being able to afford and plan for services for future communities. And some have estimated there's a $20 billion shortage in enabling works for new housing. So there's a big gap there in terms of just thinking we can rely on the private sector to supply additional housing. But we know that, as I outlined, local government's key to getting these good outcomes for communities and building those partnerships in order to get better outcomes relating to building these communities and addressing the specific needs of their local communities. So that's what gives me real hope about addressing this housing challenge because of local government's strengths there. So if we think to the next challenge around climate change, there's a few different dimensions that we're seeing local governments respond, and that's across the transition to net zero, how they're adapting to changes in climate, and how they're dealing with the emergency management response. And we've heard from different places across these things as well. So the transition to net zero is a big focus nationally. There's just been a new federal agency set up called the Net Zero Economy Agency, which is focused on workforce transition, particularly in the regions. So there's a big focus on how we achieve these national targets. But for local governments in inner city areas, they're grappling with the take-up of EVs and charging infrastructure. Where do they put it? Particularly in higher density areas, like in the city of Sydney, where there's a lot of terrace homes. There's not room for people to charge their vehicles off street. So they're thinking about how do they use public land for these assets around charging. So there's a lot of work happening around how to convert apartments and higher density dwellings to accommodate EVs. So it's been really interesting to see. In regional areas, the focus for the net zero transition is really on renewable investment, but local government's getting involved thinking about how does the community see a benefit from these investments in major renewables? And there's a lot of investment happening. There's guidelines in New South Wales. We haven't yet seen guidelines in Victoria around community benefit sharing schemes and approaches. But a lot of investors in major renewables are offering councils some money for new pool, new library in regional areas. But there's only so many pools and libraries that they need. What they need is a long-term sustainable approach where community can get the benefits from these investments and returns in renewables. So we're seeing a lot of focus around that and how the renewable investment can see improved workforce participation, socioeconomic mobility, and local wealth retention as well. So there's some really interesting things happening there in lots of different regions. If we think about climate adaptation, councils are rapidly coming to grips with climate risks, both because they can see them coming and we've got better data now about what's happening, but also the last 5 years we've seen it all in different regions with increased extreme weather events. Councils are dealing with understanding the health impacts of more and more extreme hotter days. So they're looking at expanding canopy cover for longer term improvements, but they're also providing pop-up cooling hubs for the short-term response because they know that there's more community health risks when there are extreme weather events. We're also seeing one of the biggest challenges for local governments is consistent data that can be shared across different levels of government to understand those risks. Because local governments are not only dealing with the impacts on their local communities of more extreme weather events, they're seeing it in how they plan for their asset renewal and their future cost implications that hits their bottom line as well. So there's a lot of challenges there in terms of adaptation. And City of Hobart has just, in Tasmania, been really focusing on their adaptation plans and how they manage their future risks as well. And as I mentioned, with emergency management, local government are at the front face of responding where there are flood events, severe storms and fires. And they're also at the front end of working with their communities to understand that risk and helping them to plan ahead. And there's been some wonderful conversations thinking about the fire events in California over the last month, and thinking about some of the systems and structures that we've got in place in Australia that provide community awareness and understanding of the risks and planning ahead the response in advance. So there's some great structures in place there, and lots of leading councils doing some great work there. So we know that over the last year, we've had a federal parliament inquiry into local government financial sustainability, and the response to natural disasters was really key in a lot of those responses from local government, particularly around the need to be better prepared for the next natural disaster, but also ensuring that there's enough funding for building back better into the future. A lot of the time funding approaches post-disaster just look to replace assets, but we really need to do more than that. Otherwise, we're just going to increase the costs in the longer term. So there's a big focus on thinking strategically about managing those risks across those key assets. So, of course, there's many other big issues we're seeing in local government in Australia. We're seeing a big focus on waste, which is a key responsibility of local government, links to circular economy and opportunities for new income streams. We're seeing a big focus on local transport provision, and also how they can support changing economies. And in the inner city areas, there's a big focus on nighttime economies and looking at that more broadly than just restaurants and bars, but what activities happen in the nighttime, like manufacturing, health services. How do we support those workers with other services and infrastructure? So there's a lot of really targeted projects happening, focused on what's happening for communities. And both addressing the housing challenge and the climate change challenges have implications for financial sustainability. Local government in Australia are under financial pressure, particularly rural and remote councils, and also the councils experiencing rapid growth. Increases in rates are largely capped and funding's being reduced. We're seeing that they're being asked to do more with less resources, and particularly less resources into longer term planning. So we're seeing a lot of challenges in being able to respond to these, given some of the financial constraints. We're also seeing really clearly that local governments can't respond to these things on their own, and they're seeing great benefits from collaboration, and not only at a regional level, but also on an issue-based level, where their issues might be common across different places and different states. Which is adding great value to what people are learning together and responding as well, and building a stronger case to state and federal governments about what's next. So I think one of the key tests for local government into 2025 is how they can take a long-term view, ideally to 2025, lift out beyond the political cycles, to play to their strengths about knowing their local communities and managing their places where policies come from the national and state level converge in place. And it's this integrated place-based planning where they can manage the climate risks and plan for communities, not just the housing, and then embed these into their operational corporate planning and financial planning with that longer term view and provide that more solid case. So I do remain optimistic about 2050, although sometimes working in this area, it is looking pretty grim. But I think that the strengths and resilience of local government means that there's good people at the helm to guide communities through some of those challenges.
Thank you, Alison. So great to hear that you're feeling optimistic. Just as a little teaser for the next section, we're going to be coming to you in the audience and asking, how optimistic are you feeling? But before we do that, we have one more amazing speaker to hear from. So Sam Broughton, President of Local Government New Zealand. So again, Sam is another speaker who brings a really interesting dual perspective. So Sam, not only are you President of Local Government New Zealand, but you are also the Mayor of a district council, which I understand is New Zealand's fastest growing area. So Sam, over to you, please, for the view from New Zealand. And after that, we will go to our polling.
Kia ora, Heather, and thank you. I think you needed a bell, actually, just to keep us the 7-minute ding, and I'll see what I can do. Yeah, ko te wera te monga, ko never te awa, ko Cressy te waka no Darfield Aho, ko Sam Broughton toku ingoa. It's a way of introducing oneself in Te Reo Māori in a traditional way to acknowledge the mountains that are around and the rivers that are special to me, and I hope you have landmarks near you that are special to you as well. I really want to thank LGIU for this, and Jonathan particularly for hosting me on my visit last year. To everyone on this call, thank you for your leadership. You sit at the coalface of delivery. We do things that affect families every day, and we also sit at the coalface of feedback, which means we bump into local people in local supermarkets and events and receive feedback face-to-face really regularly as well. The New Zealand context, we have 3 tiers of local government. We have regional councils, we have district and city councils. They have directly elected mayors, and we have some unitary councils that cover both regional and districts. And we have community boards which sit over towns or sometimes groups of towns, but they aren't standard right across New Zealand. We have a 3-year political term. It's really short, it's way too short. And we have elections this year in local government. Local government collects about 10% compared to what central government collects as far as the tax take in our country goes, and is funded really through property rates, usually capital value, sometimes land value. And the average rates increase last year across the country was 16%, a massive lift from where we had been previously. Our structure was set up 36 years ago. There's been very little change since, and no ability to evolve. So any change ends up being like quite a big conversation. We had a review for local government set up about 3 years ago by the government, and it showed the need for structural change to be fit for the purposes of today. And we need to have overall system shift. But at the moment, local government's been reshaped by central government, feels by stealth. They're changing the way we deal with water and wastewater. They're changing the way we use our resources and what activities can happen in parts around the country through the Resource Management Act. They're changing who can control building activities. All things that have been responsibilities of councils is under change. But there's been no real big movement in the structural changes that New Zealand needs. We've got Auckland with 1.5 million people. And the smallest council is about 700 people in the Chatham Islands. So like the Australian example, there's some generalisations that I'm going to make here. 3 changes for this year. Water and wastewater reform. We've had 5 years of conversations through different governments of how they were going to reform water and wastewater. At the moment, 67 different councils deal with it in 67 different ways. Political pressure to keep rates low means there's been historic underinvestment in our water and wastewater systems. It's led to about a $2 billion need for investment over the next 30 years, a sum far bigger than what we have spent in the last 30 years. And at the moment, there's no plan for how that's going to be funded, other than leaving it to councils to come up with new structures. Either keep things in-house as they are, political interference being the main problem over the last 30 years, that political interference and investment doesn't change in that situation. CCOs, council-controlled organisations, being set up arm's length with independent boards, or consumer trusts are the sort of models that are being discussed by councils at the moment. That is going to lead to some major change within councils, and we'll know more probably in about 2 or 3 months as councils consult with their communities over the options that are best for them. Second thing happening this year is around local government structure. It's not changing at all, but we do need to have conversations, and it's acknowledged that we need to have these conversations. They happen, I feel, between mayors when we're at lunch or when we are at morning tea, but they never really make it onto an agenda because they're quite hard conversations to have about the structure of local government. The government has said they'd like us to work with a population figure of about 200,000 people. That's way bigger than most councils across the country. And I saw in the chat I guess it's UK talking about 500,000 is the right population. So we're talking 200. But we do need to get both bigger and smaller. We've got to get bigger to deal with water and wastewater and transport and spatial planning. And we need to get smaller to stay local to our communities. My district's too big for me to meaningfully connect with all the towns in my district. But we're too small, and we partner with our neighbours to do that big stuff, and structural change would help that. We need new funding. At the moment, we collect rates and we can use debt. And many councils are already at their debt ceiling, and that's putting pressure on the ability to grow. We'd like the government to increase visitor levies or introduce visitor levies or accommodation levies to allow councils to collect mineral royalties, for that to come back to councils. For there to be the GST that's collected on new builds, which is goods and services tax, for that to be returned to councils to incentivise growth. And we need central government devolution. So as we think about working as regions or sub-regions, we need the government to think about how they do health and education and how that might be pushed into the regions as well. I think historically we've tried to work through like collaboration agreements, and from what I've seen, they can work really well. But only as long as the leaders who put them in place remain in place. And as soon as there's an election and a leader leaves, the new leader comes in and goes, why are we sharing that with them? And are you sure that's the right way to do it? And everything gets thrown up in the air again. And the last thing for me this year is around how do we attract talent into political roles across the country. Elections this year, we've got a number of councils, over half of our councils have elected to have Māori wards, to have Māori participation directly on their councils. The government has decided that instead of councils deciding whether they can have that, it needs to go to a referendum. So there's a number of people standing this year for the council seat, not even knowing whether there's a seat at the end of the election, even if they win that seat. Councillors in New Zealand tend to be part-time, unless you're a city councillor or a mayor of a district. And that means we tend to have people who are older and retired, who are flexible in their part-time roles, or have a very flexible employer, or a flexible spouse and family situation. And that's not the vast majority of people in our country. So it means diversity and representation can be a bit of a challenge. And we need people who are older and retired, and we need people who are flexible and part-time, but we need the best people in our communities to put their hand up for these roles. And at the moment, paying people pittance doesn't actually attract them to these roles. And in an election, it feels like in New Zealand society, the middle ground has been lost to the extremes, and anything that gets said is outrageous, and it becomes very hard to have sensible conversations. So those are the challenges ahead for us this year, but I guess like the speakers ahead of me, there's big moments for us that are coming, but I'm really positive for our future. I think local government, as I said at the beginning, does so much good in our communities, and I'm looking forward to these changes enhancing what we can do. And thank LGIU for bringing us together today. Kia ora, thank you.
Well, thanks to you, Sam. That was, again, another really thought-provoking and extensive talk. So over to everybody else, over to the audience. I mean, before we do that, I just want to say a big thank you for all the amazing comments, chats, links that have been shared in the chat. If you haven't looked, can only suggest that you have a look to see what's being posted there, because some really good comments and posts. But as I said, it's now over to you, the audience, and we are going to ask you the question, what are your priorities for local government in the year ahead? What does it mean for the next 25 years? So we have a few different polls coming up. So let's take it away. So there will be a link posted in the chat or a QR code, whichever you prefer. And so there are a couple of different ways for you to take part in this live poll. Thanks, Jane. So Jane Sankara, our colleague from LGIU, has just posted the link in the chat. So what we should be able to see now is that as people respond to this poll, we should start to see some numbers coming through. So we've given you a list of suggestions here. Really fascinated to see how people respond. Okay, we've got some numbers coming through now. So we have an amazing 111 people on this call. So expecting lots of intelligence, lots of answers, lots of views. And the big question is, will the same things that our speakers talked about, will they come through in your answers? If anyone's having any difficulties with the poll, you can, of course, reach out to LGIU, to Barry O'Brien, and he will help you. But it seems like lots of people are getting on with it and are entering their answers. So thank you so much. Numbers still coming in. So can we go back to we've lost our numbers. Can we go back, please? Okay, so it looks like this is the final outcome then. So for this first poll, which is what are the top 3 priorities for local government in 2025, just by a whisker. Oh, it's a very close race in the top 3 answers. So we currently have financial sustainability, which is the top priority, housing and homelessness, just a fraction behind, and transforming infrastructure. But really interested to see the diversity of people's responses there. Okay, financial sustainability pulling ahead just a smidge. Okay, thank you so much, people doing the poll. I think it's time to move on to our next one. So if someone could capture the results, that would be great. Let's move on to the next one. We have a slightly different question for the next one. Okay, so thinking more into the future. So you've given us your answer for 2025. Thinking more longer term, does your answer change? Do you give a different answer? So we'd like you to look at the same options and see whether your answer is still the same. So again, you have 3 choices. Please give us your top 3 priorities for local government for the future. And that's fascinating that we're seeing some very different answers coming through. So great to talk to the panel and get your view on why that is. So thank you so much to people who have already answered. We've got 55 and growing. Can we get closer to the 100 mark? We've got 100 people in the call. So if everyone could please take the poll, that would be amazing. Any more inputs? So we've been stable for a few seconds now, and it looks like the top 3 answers on this particular question are adapting to and mitigating climate change, investing and transforming infrastructure and services, and improving the financial sustainability of the sector. So if the person controlling the poll could just scroll down so we can see the answers at the bottom, that will be great. No, okay, all right, so moving on. So we have a slightly different question for our next question. So Alison and Sam, you already answered this yourself, so we know what you're thinking, but we wanted to ask everybody else. So if our poll maestro could please take us to the next question. Drum roll, please. Okay, and the question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how optimistic are you about the future of local government? So, tricky one to answer. Maybe it slightly depends on how early you had to get up this morning, whether or not you need another cup of coffee. But let's get a sense of how optimistic people are feeling. This is so interesting, just seeing these numbers move around. So no one's saying not at all optimistic, which is great. So we have absolutely no, oh, okay. We now have a couple of people saying not particularly optimistic. But it looks like, I'm just going to try and summarize these changing results, but it looks like most people are in the fairly passive camp. So quite optimistic, broadly optimistic, but not super optimistic. So that is fascinating. So we have, as you can see, we have the scores under the different answers there, but we also have an average score of 6.4. So thank you so much to everyone who participated in that. So I believe we have one more thing to show you. So this is a slightly different request of everybody, but in one word, if you can, Could you give us one word to say what the council of the future looks like? What an amazing first suggestion. Connected. Nice. Synaptic. Fascinating. So we have, looking for our word cloud, it looks like our top 3 most popular answers are resilient, collaborative, and innovative, which I'm thrilled to see because these are 3 of the things that LGIU kind of exists for, to be collaborative, to share innovation. So that is great to see, but also fascinating to see just how many different answers there are to that question. And we still got a couple of people typing. So let's wait a minute. Okay, you're going to have to be quick now because we are heading for a finish in 8 minutes. Okay, so it looks like all the numbers are in. So just to reassure, we will be sharing all of these data items, all of these poll results with our resource pack that will go out after the event. It will go out very soon after the event for the person asking the question. So everyone who's either signed up to be here or made it on the day, we'll send you an email with all of the resources, the recording, and everything that you've heard today. But we now have time for some finishing reflections. So, I mean, quite difficult to know how to use this very, very precious last 8 minutes because we've had so many fascinating reflections from around the room. And there's been so many excellent questions in the chat. But I think what would feel right to me is that if we asked our amazing panel just to give us some reflections on what they're hearing from the room. So you've seen the poll responses, you've seen how people have answered differently, and also you've seen the one word description. You've got a sense of how optimistic people are. What we have time for is a 1 minute finishing reflection from each of our speakers. So let's do it in the reverse order. So let's hear from Sam first of all. Sam, I'm going to have to ask you to stick to 1 minute, please.
Well, I'd just say let's be aware of who we are, our own humanity, and the bias that we bring to all situations that we turn up in. That our own views and our own history is only just that, it's our own. We don't know other people in the room's breakfast. We don't understand the phone call they just had from their cousin the day before. We don't know what their hopes are for tomorrow with their spouse. And we need to leave room and conversations for other people, for their histories and their hopes for the future. And I think if we can learn to do that well, that's why I'm so optimistic about the future, because I think we can learn to do that better in local government, and we're going to need to. So, yeah, that's my reflection. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. For those of us who are just getting up and starting our day, you are giving us a perfect positive start. So thank you. So carrying on with our backwards look around the panelists, Alison, what's your reflections on what you've heard from our polls?
Well, I've learned an enormous amount through the discussion and the chat this evening. So thank you to everyone. I think there's a key kind of theme coming out across that collaboration and some of those shared challenges and ideas. And I think there's, real opportunity to build off that in addressing some of these big challenges. So I would, great to see collaboration in those keywords.
Thanks, Alison. So I should have just said that if any of the presenters saw any questions in the Q&A that they particularly wanted to answer and they saw it and they thought, oh, that's the one for me, please feel free. So if you'd rather do that than give a finishing reflection, you can. So Sean, how would you like to leave us?
Just the commonality of many of the issues across all of the different jurisdictions, but I'm particularly struck by the comparators coming through from New Zealand and Australia. I mean, Alison could have been giving her presentation about Ireland and what she said in terms of housing and climate change, and Sam in terms of diversity and representation, etc. So, there are a lot of common problems, and the more of this sort of engagement that we have, the more we realise we're not sitting on our own little islands, metaphorically and physically. So, well done, folks. Really interesting.
Thanks, Sean. So over the border on the island of Ireland to Alison.
Thanks. I suppose thing that I always come back to is that we've talked a lot about change coming whenever, people move on. And I think one of the things I believe most strongly is that the systems, both the political and the administrative systems, should be immune to that. And that's what we should be working towards, that it doesn't matter whether, at a political or administrative level, there is a change that the people that we serve deserve, that the systems we maintain that kind of those standards of delivery and maintain those values and behaviours. And it's a source of great frustration to me when you're doing great work with someone and then all of a sudden they disappear and then, you're back to square one again. So I think we should all be working towards making sure that we're immune to the movement of people and that the systems basically create the conditions for it to be maintained.
Alison, thank you. So going to a person who certainly does know a lot about the governance of different islands, which is Pippa from Argyll and Bute in Scotland. Pippa, it feels like such a long time since we heard from you because we've heard so much in the meantime. But if you could give us your 1 minute finishing reflections on what you've heard today.
Yes, yeah, I'm responsible for 23 inhabited islands over here. I think there's been so many similarities, when we hear about housing, infrastructure, climate, they're all very real for us. So despite our structures or our size, the issues are very similar. I just saw in the comments, a comment about the constitutional protection. Just to be clear, we don't have constitutional protection in Scotland, and it's something we're aiming for. And I think, what I'm hearing is a really optimistic view from people about what local government can do. We hear about the commitment, we're hearing about the innovation, we're hearing about an openness, and I think there is real scope if those skills and that passion and commitment and the closeness we have with our communities could be used more effectively. So I think there is so much more we can do, is my belief, and if we are unleashed to work on our local systems, I think the sky's the limit. So hopefully that sets us off on an optimistic start for the rest of the day.
It certainly does. Thank you, Pippa. So almost the final word then to Jonathan Carr-West from LGIU.
Thanks, Heather. So 4 very quick things. Firstly, I think this morning illustrates, our sort of intuition or our sort of belief that we can usefully learn from each other in local government across the world, I think is illustrated by this morning's event, both the speakers and the incredibly rich chat. So that's great. I thought that word cloud was really interesting because actually, innovative, collaborative, resilient, but all the other littler words kind of tended in the same direction as well. Agile, synaptic, except broke perhaps, but all were about a council that doesn't just do things, but makes things happen, right? That's part. So we know where we need to get to. We know the direction of travel. The polling was really interesting. The difference between short term and long term, though. Yeah. So what we've heard this morning, I think, is that in all the jurisdictions that we're talking about today, and of course there are, as people have pointed out, many others that we are yet to talk about. But there's a bit of a burning platform. There are things that are happening now. Things, there was an urgency in all of our speakers. And I think that goes back to the point I made in my contribution, that the challenge of responding to the urgent and the stuff we need to do now, while keeping an eye on the future and the world we need to create for tomorrow, that challenge is central to what we do. And then my very final reflection is I am not surprised to see the optimism come out in that poll, because most of the people, well, almost everyone on this call either works for or as a representative or is engaged in local government in some way or another, and therefore by definition are optimists, because if we weren't essentially professional optimists, we would go off and do something else. I would flip it slightly. I would say, look, are we optimistic about it? Look, the point is that the world is challenging and difficult, and if we are going to do the things we need to do, if we are going to redesign public services, if we are going to shift towards prevention, if we're going to help communities to be resilient and self-actualizing, if we're going to fix democracy, we can only do that through local government. So some of you will have seen, there's a version of a talk I do. I did it over in Australia a couple of years ago. Only local government can save the world. And I think the responses we see today illustrate that, and that's why we have a duty to optimism, because we are, you know, the alternative is unthinkable.
Jonathan, thank you. And I set it up so that no one had to go after you this time. So I think that was a wise move, given the points you just made, which have brought us to such a lovely natural close and natural ending. So now the only thing for me to do is to say thank you so much to everyone who's joined us today, people who've come in the middle of the night, at the start of the day, at the end of the day. So a big thank you to you. These events would be nothing without the people who come and give their comments and share their insights. So thank you so much. Thank you also to our incredible panel of speakers. You have shared so much and the discussion has been so rich. So thank you.